These are your way to early top 20 wide receiver redraft rankings. My name is Cameron Lawrence, and I am joined by one of my best friends in the entire world, man. You just got to say it, Mr. Tyler Plath. Welcome to the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Like I said, we're talking top 20 wide receivers. We got some low budget productions. If you haven't noticed, I'm in a different area. If you're on YouTube, I'm holding the mic today. I got stuff behind me, but that's not going to stop us from going all in on these top 20 wide receivers. Ty, are you excited for this?
Very excited. I mean, this position is what makes or breaks most people's fantasy teams. And we got some really interesting conversations coming up with some of these guys. Some guys that we're very in on, some guys that we are very much out on.
Yes.
20 guys, so we got to fly.
Yeah, well, we're even going to give you some honorable mentions too. So it's actually going to end up being 24, but really fast, just because we need to say it. Who do you got tonight? I guess by tomorrow they'll know. But we got that T-Wolves Mavs game, our T-Wolves, baby, in the conference championship.
We did it.
And we did it. I mean, that game 7 was one of the craziest games I've ever watched any sport ever, So, I mean, that was why. I guess maybe not Minneapolis Miracle level, but it's close. It was climbing up there.
Look, 20-point comeback on the road against the defending champs.
I mean, the two-time defending champs. I'm all for Ant-Man. All righty. Well, we can't spend too much more time on this, so we'll jump right in. But I promise we'll bring it up a couple times during the show. Alrighty, quickly before we hop into our top 20, we got 3 honorable mentions. Kind of 3 very different wide receivers too. Zay Flowers, Davante Smith, and DK Metcalf, right? We got the second-year guy, Davante Smith, I think is going into year 4, DK year 6. Ty, just pick one of those 3 to just talk about. Just give us the good and the bad of one of those 3.
Let's do DK Metcalf, who seems to kind of be the I call him the enigma of the 3 honorable mentions, just because he's probably got the most change going on with his situation, right? You've got Ryan Grubb coming in from Washington, so it's a former college offensive coordinator now going to be calling plays for an NFL team. But if you paid attention at all to Washington and how I don't want to say pass heavy they were, but they utilized all 3 wide receivers, Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk, and Rome Odunze. Then it's I'm not going to say it's a 1-for-1 in terms of the wide receiver talent going from Washington to Seattle, but if there is a wide receiver that's going to thrive the most between Lockett, JSN, and DK Metcalf, it's going to be DK, because he is the biggest and most physical wide receiver, and that is the kind of wide receiver that had success in this Washington offense between Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk. So I have to think that Grubb is going to really use DK Metcalf as the focal point of the passing attack. So for where most people have him ranked and where he's going in most like best ball drafts right now, I know we're talking redraft, but DK Metcalf might be one of my favorite targets in this weird wide receiver 2 range, where we've got a ton of young up and coming talent, but we've also got some aging veterans in this range too. So I'm fascinated with DK Metcalf this year.
Yeah, it does feel a lot like last year, where we have like 8 or 9 wide receiver 1s, and then we have like 15, 20 guys who could be labeled a wide receiver 2 this season. But yeah, it feels like too in Seattle, the fight in Seattle is between JSN and Lockett, right? It feels like DK is pretty solidified.
Yeah.
And it's JSN and Lockett who are going to kind of go back and forth. I'll talk about Davante Smith. I know you're not quite as in on him as I am. And I think he has a very similar range to DK this season, but for very different reasons, right? DK is going to be all about yards and touchdowns, right? If DK hits double-digit touchdowns, we could see him, creeping into that top 10 range this season. Davante Smith's going to be about targets. We saw it 2 years ago. It looked like, hey, he might lead this team in targets this next year. And then A.J. Brown said, nope, sorry, buddy. Like, this is my team. This is, you're the number 2. So can he take another step forward? Can he get closer to that 150, maybe even get up to 160, but probably that 150 target mark this season? If he can, I think he could be a high wide receiver 1. And then the last guy on here, obviously Zay Flowers. It's just he's in Baltimore, right? I mean, I think that's the only thing that really caps him right now. Is they're just such a run first team. I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on Zay Flowers.
No, I mean the biggest change for Baltimore will be their offensive line because they lost 3 starters. So yes, you signed Derrick Henry, but in the passing game, they're not gonna. I don't anticipate them getting as many big plays downfield as they had last year. That kind of benefits Zay Flowers, who just kind of eats in the short game. A lot of design screens to him, get him out in space. I'm very, very intrigued as well with Zay Flowers going into year 2 with Lamar Jackson, with Todd Monken staying in Baltimore. I think there's a lot of good to come from Zay Flowers this year.
Definitely. All righty. Let's dive into these top 20 because, like Ty said, we got to fly through these today because we're talking about a lot of guys, but we'll give you what you need to know. We'll prepare you for your drafts, and especially if you're hitting those best ball drafts already, like you should be if you're listening to our show at this point. Code fellas on Underdog Fantasy. Quick plug. These are the rankings that you need to know because, like we said, that wide receiver 10 to 25 range gets pretty sticky. So we're going to kind of help you out here. And we'll start with our first one at wide receiver 20. We do have a tie, and it is between Cooper Kupp and Stefon Diggs. We'll start with Kupp. Last season, again, a little disappointing, right? He only played 12 games after playing only 9 the year before. 95 targets, 59 receptions, 737 yards, 5 touchdowns. Obviously, Puka Nacua comes, breaks all the rookie records last year, the talk of the town. He's 2 years removed from that season where he had 191 targets, 145 yards with just shy of 2,000 or 145 receptions, excuse me, just shy of 2,000 yards at 1947 and 16 touchdowns. Just an amazing stat line. But obviously, we're 2 years removed from that, right? He hasn't played more than 12 games in a season. So, Ty, if we're looking at it, Kupp, I don't have our rankings on Kupp.
I do.
All right. What are our rankings on Kupp? And then give us your outlook for Kupp this season.
He is your wide receiver 19. He is my wide receiver 24. And I'll throw out this disclaimer real quick. These are way early rankings.
Mm-hmm.
We are currently working on our draft guide. At least some of us are, because some of us have some more adult things going on in our life, like, moving in and stuff like that. By the way, hey, real quick, we didn't even mention this at the top. Cameron is back. He's back. And it's so good to have him back. Back in Minnesota, but also back on the podcast because look, Lucas is what we like to call our fearless leader and host, but sometimes he just can get kind of boring. You know what I mean?
Oh, giving him the shot. We
need
it.
to get back on.
We love it.
Back on we're spiraling out of control without our fearless leader.
We love it.
So again, Cooper Kupp is your wide receiver 19. He's my wide receiver 24. I really just think it's because Cooper Kupp getting out there in age at this point with Puka, who has really kind of established himself as the one in this offense.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of banking on this Rams offense continuing to be as efficient as they were last year, and they have all the tools and pieces to do that. But I don't think we're the days of pushing 15, 16, 17 points a game are kind of over just because of the role that he's going to be in with Puka Nacua and the run game now after kind of doubling down on the investment with Blake Corum now too. So Cooper Kupp still has plenty of value. I struggle when I'm looking at, again, guys that we've mentioned before, where Zay Flowers, DK Metcalf, who I have ranked ahead of Cooper Kupp, I see them giving me higher upside, on a week-to-week basis than a Cooper Kupp does in a wide receiver 2 role, in an offense that we need to bank on being hyper efficient again.
No, that makes sense for sure. I don't think I'm at the point where I'm ready to say he's firmly the 2. I think it's like a 1B, 1A situation. I think he's closer. Okay. I think it's got a lot. I mean, obviously injuries were a big part of the last 2 seasons. It's not Christian McCaffrey, but I do think it's a little similar in the way of we're getting that discount right now because of the injuries. I think if he's back healthy, if he's full go, if these injuries aren't nagging at all, then I think, then we can get really excited. The biggest difference between the 2, the reason I'm not saying he is because he's 30 years old and McCaffrey, when he came back from it, was 25, right? So, I mean, the very, very different in age, but I just think the guy is so extremely talented. I mean, he was the wide receiver 22 last year, or in 2022, and he only played 9 games, right? I mean, that's pretty ridiculous. That's like Jefferson was this last season. So I still think he's got that crazy upside. It's just, what does the role look like with Puka, right? That is the big question. All righty, let's move on to Mr. Stefon Diggs. Now in Houston, probably the biggest landscape change out of any wide receiver we're going to talk about. If you just listen to his stat line from last season, it sounds pretty good from just the full year, right? 160 targets, 107 receptions, 1,183 yards, and 8 touchdowns. But if you were a Stefon Diggs manager last year, you were hurting down the stretch. I mean, it was brutal down the stretch. So, Ty, is that a sign of what we're going to see this year? Do you think that was the coaching change that happened? How are you feeling about all of that going into this year?
I think first the Buffalo side of things, right? Because I think the question a lot of people are going to ask is, he's also getting up there in age too. So
yes,
was there a decline in his play? And I mean, you can literally, I mean, you don't need to go watch film. You can literally just look at box scores and stat lines and say, wow, production dropped off as soon as Joe Brady came in and started calling plays after they fired Ken Dorsey. And when Ken Dorsey was their offensive coordinator and playing calls, Stefon Diggs was a top 3 wide receiver. So I maybe like 2% of what happened in the second half of the year is due to a decline in his overall play. But this is still one of the very top end target getters in the league. And now he's going to Houston, where it's a semi-complicated wide receiver room to break down, because you've got Nico Collins, you've got Tank Dell, and now you've got Stefon Diggs in the mix. But what it comes down to is that this Houston offense is going to have a ton of passing volume. CJ Stroud can support each of these guys. I can't make the argument that they're all going to be like top 20 guys or all top 25 guys. But I think each of these guys on a weekly basis can give you some very, very good performances. So look, I get the hesitancy for most people with Stefon Diggs, and I know that there will be some people that are like, Stefon Diggs is an avoid at all costs just because of where he will probably be going in drafts, and I get it. But if he starts to slide down boards and stuff in your drafts, you still have to take the shot on the guy, because again, it's not like this was it was a coaching change where we saw the big dip in performance, or in at least fantasy production. So I'm still relatively in on Stefon Diggs, but for the reasons that I mentioned about just being in a 3-headed wide receiver room now, the upside is relatively capped just because people are going to be fighting for targets.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you look at him the last 4 seasons, right? 160 targets. He had 154 one year. Every other year, 160 plus, 1,100 plus yards, 105 plus receptions, and 8 plus touchdowns. To see that kind of volume again is going to be tough in this offense, right? When we talk about Nico Collins, when we talk about Tank Dell, I think if he's still in Buffalo, for me, he's still in that Davante Adams, Mike Evans range, because I still believe in the talent of Stefon Diggs. It's just, how great can he be in this crowded wide receiver room when we saw those two really take a huge step forward last season? So that's really where the issue comes with Stefon Diggs. He is my wide receiver 21, your wide receiver 22. So we're pretty similar on him. Look at him as a low end wide receiver 2, who's probably going to be pretty consistent. I know he wasn't last year, but if you're going to pick one of these 3 wide receivers in this offense to be more consistent out of the 3, he's probably going to be that guy, right? Nico Collins is going to be the guy that's going to have those big up and down weeks. And then, kind of Tank Dell will kind of fit in from there. But yeah. All right, let's move on to our wide receiver 19.
18.
18, excuse me. 18.
Because it's another tie.
It's another tie. You got me there. Jaylen Waddle and Nico Collins. We'll start with Jaylen Waddle. He is my wide receiver 17, your wide receiver 19. Last season, Jaylen Waddle played 14 games, 104 targets, 72 receptions, 1,014 yards, and 4 touchdowns. He has had 100 plus targets, 70 plus receptions, and 1,000 plus yards each of his first 3 seasons. And I just wanted you to hear this yards per reception this dude's had, because it has been extreme, both sides. Yards per reception is rookie year, 9.8. Year 2, 18.1. Last year, 14.8. It kind of feels like he's probably going to stay in that 14 to 15 yard per reception range this season. He did have 72 receptions this year and 75 last year in 3 less games. So I think part of the, if we were watching, part of the game plan for him was maybe less down the field and trying to get him more involved across the middle too. If you're looking at Jaylen Waddle, first, is there any chance he touches Tyreek Hill this season? Like, is there any chance he really becomes that 1B? And then second, what is that ceiling then if you say, no, he's not going to be the 1B to Tyreek? He's firmly the 2.
I mean, we've seen it in back-to-back years. Yes, like he had a good year 1 with Tyreek Hill, but then we really saw that this offense just focused on Tyreek Hill. Now, is there an opportunity for a bounce back? Sure, because if we go back to last year and where Jaylen Waddle was going in drafts, Jaylen Waddle was a late round 2, his ADP said he was a early round 3, but a lot of people were like, well, wide receivers after him are not really as intriguing as he is just being in Miami. So he pretty often went late second round as the wide receiver 11. So now we're talking about him as the wide receiver 18, 19 range. And that's not to say that we don't think that, he's not a worthy investment. And if anything, I am much more intrigued with Jaylen Waddle at this price point than I was at last year. Right. So to your question of like, can he be a 1B? I think he has a better chance of just being a wide receiver 2 than a 1B, just because again, this offense is pretty it's built on the Tua Tyreek connection. So while it's not what we would want a 1B situation for Jaylen Waddle, it's not going to be that, but because of how explosive this offense can be, he's going to be a very, very heavily invested wide receiver 2, again, wide receiver 12 to 24, wide receiver 2s, right? So I like where he's going in drafts this year, just because, again, last year we were banking on him as a 1B, and that's just not how this offense is going to operate.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think for me, I'm just like you. I'm very in on Jaylen Waddle this year, and it has to do with price point. It has to do with the fact that you're getting him in the 3rd round. And, some of these guys that we'll talk about, later, Brandon Aiyuk, Chris Olave, Michael Pittman, right? I view them very similar to Jaylen Waddle. It's just they're going a full round earlier than him. And, that makes me a little more inclined to go, okay, I'm in on Jaylen Waddle because I kind of know what to expect from him this season, right? But I also know that this Miami team has crazy upside week to week, right? I mean, Jaylen Waddle's in an offense and he's going to be in a role where he can drop you 35, 40 points in a week, and it's really not out of the realm of possibilities for him. So yeah, I really like Jaylen Waddle this season. Definitely way more back in with him moving back about a full round. The next guy we'll talk about is actually Stefon Diggs' teammate, Mr. Nico Collins. You jumped the gun there, Ty.
I did. I kind of forgot that Nico Collins is also
we don't care.
Waddle.
Ty doesn't even care. And what is surprising about him not caring is Nico's my wide receiver 22, and he's Ty's wide receiver 14. So last season for Nico, I'm just going to read this, and we can go back and forth a little bit here. 109 targets, 80 receptions, 1,297 yards, and 8 touchdowns. So, Tyler, why don't you give me the pro Nico argument, and I will come back with the negative Nico argument.
So, for Nico Collins, in what I'm evaluating, is that this guy is going to continue being not only downfield capable, but he's got this. When I say sneaky athletic, I don't mean it in a like in a derogatory way or by any
Mhm.
means, but I mean, you don't think of Nico Collins as some guy that can be a legit threat after the catch. Just
Yeah.
because you think of Nico Collins, you're like, oh, he's just a big bodied wide receiver, right? Nico Collins showed last year that he's a threat after the catch. And if anything, getting closer to the red zone, he's the target. He's the target, right? So, yes, they did go out and trade for Joe Mixon. So maybe the red zone opportunities do take a bit of a hit because it's not Devin Singletary and Damian Pierce that you have to rely on if you're going to run it in. But I think if there's a guy that is going to kind of fit that, what is the X role in this wide receiver room, it's Nico Collins, and X wide receivers typically have the most high end success. I mean, we talk about CeeDee Lamb, we talk about Jamar Chase, we talk about Justin Jefferson, Amon Ra St Brown, right? Nico Collins is in that role just in this Houston offense. So I will say this then too. Is there a chance that we see some regression just because he was a top 10 wide receiver last year on just 109 targets? Absolutely. But how much regression do we go? I mean, how much regression is that to go from a top 10 wide receiver to the wide receiver 22? And that's where I'll turn it over to you to kind of explain your reasoning then.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with just what I talk about with Diggs, right? 3 wide receivers. And like you said, for me, it worries me a little bit that he only had 109 targets last season in 15 games when Tank Dell was, fighting injury, Noah Brown was fighting injury. So that's what worries me a little bit, is just the lack of targets. The fact that he wasn't drawing in 130, 140 targets last season. And now you bring in a guy like Stefon Diggs, who's coming off 4 straight seasons of 160 plus. So I do still think there's that wide receiver 2 upside, but I'm just worried that it's going to be a lot more inefficient. And you're just going to be reliant on those boom bust weeks, which I know doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to finish lower, but for me, that's also why I've been relatively out on him in his current ADP.
So, quick question then, and we probably gotta start flying through some of these guys that own single spots in our rankings. But Jaylen Waddle as a 2 in this Miami offense, or a Nico Collins who can very much be a 1B in this offense, or even the 1A. Taking ADP out, just focusing on role, would you say that Nico Collins is probably the more attractive player?
I get it, but I still think Jaylen Waddle is a much better wide receiver. Like, I think Nico's a great wide receiver.
Fair. Yeah.
Which is why I trust Jaylen Waddle more, especially in an offense where I know they're for sure going to be getting into space a lot. I know this Houston offense was great last season, and I think they're going to be great again next year. But I feel more confident for me in Jaylen Waddle's role than I do Nico Collins after just having one great year for Nico last season. So that for me personally is why I have Jaylen Waddle ahead of Nico Collins.
And that makes complete sense.
Yep. Alrighty. Next, we got Mr. Deebo Samuel at 17. I got him at 18. Ty, you got him at 17. We're pretty close on him. And man, if you look at just receiving numbers last year, you're like, how the heck is he 17? Because he had 89 targets, 60 receptions. He was I believe he was the 4th leading receiver on his own team last season. You want to fact check me on that? I think
I will
Aiyuk,
pull that up.
Kittle, and CMC all had more receptions than he did last year. 892 yards. He did only play 15 games, 7 touchdowns, but then he had 37 rushing attempts for 225 yards and 5 touchdowns. And I think the thing for me with Deebo is you look at that and you go, man, can he really get 5 rushing touchdowns again next year? Can he really get 225 rushing yards? Yeah, because CMC just had one of the best, rushing seasons we've seen in quite a while, putting up, I want to say 15 or 16 rushing touchdowns last year, 1,500 yards, close to 300 touches. And so when you add the rushing and receiving together, that's what's really keeping Deebo relevant. That's why seeing these, 89 targets, 94 the year before, his highest is only 121, isn't as concerning because he's such a danger after the catch and he's so good when they give him the ball out of the backfield.
Yeah. the reason why, like, I think last year he was going closer to wide receiver, like
He was
12
like Waddle last year,
Like I'm gonna double check that because
but he was very high. It was very high last year because he was coming off that big season.
yeah, he was wide receiver. Why am I missing his name? I can't read all of a sudden. Hello. So actually, no, he was going around. It was the year before that he had all that
Yep.
steam. He was wide receiver 16 at draft time last year. And that's kind of where we have him this year. And that's where Deebo, average finish was right around here, just because it's not consistent enough.
Mm-hmm.
But you know that when he hits,
yeah,
he hits, right? So he's kind of I don't want to call him risky wide receiver twos, but I'm only interested in pairing him up if I can get if I can get a Amon Ra St. Brown or a Puka Nacua or something like that in round one, just because I know that they are going to be consistent with how they produce. So then I'm covered when Deebo has his down weeks, but then it's then an even better week when Deebo hits with then my wide receiver one.
Yeah, I feel like he's a little similar to James Conner, just in the way of when you draft him, he's going to miss 3 or 4 games. And you just have to know that, and you have to be okay with that when you draft him, right? And that comes a lot with the role that he plays in that backfield. If you get him all 17, you're ecstatic. But you're expecting him to miss 2 or 3, maybe 4 games during the season. All right, let's do one more guy, and then we'll take a quick break. And that is, actually, I guess we're doing 2. We're doing 2. Excuse me. Sorry. We're doing 2 here. We got Drake London and DJ Moore. Drake London, I am shocked by this, Ty. Shocked, let me tell you, because I have him as the wide receiver 14. And you, me and Lucas both thought would for sure be the highest out of all of us on him, have him down at wide receiver 18. Now, his stat line last year wasn't great, obviously. 110 targets, 69 receptions, 2 touchdowns. 2 touchdowns. Disgusting. He finished as the wide receiver 42. So, Ty, what can you explain your ranking? Because I think the people feel like you're more of a pro Drake London guy, and yet you're dropping him to 18. And in best ball drafts, he's the wide receiver 10 right now.
Yeah. So first, these are way too early rankings. You can see the official rankings in our draft guide. But what this comes down to for me is the production has not been there just yet. And we're already pushing him into this echelon of that he is going to produce, right?
Fair enough.
Now, wide receiver 18, probably a little pessimistic, probably a little cautious on my end. But I think I want people to not just look at, oh, wow, the play caller is coming from the Rams and they're going to see like the exact same success as the Rams did, or like he's got Kirk Cousins and what Kirk Cousins did with Justin Jefferson. Kirk Cousins had Kevin O'Connell and Justin Jefferson, right? And Zach Robinson, yes, he had Puka and Matt Stafford and Cooper Kupp. He was not the play. He wasn't calling plays. That's Sean McVay, right? So I think I'm not going to sit here and say that like we're getting ahead of ourselves with Drake London, because I know that the situation is immensely better than what it was last year with Arthur Smith. I just hate the fact that at least in best ball, we're putting top 10 expectation on the guy.
Yeah.
If he's not going to, he's really got to come through, because in half PPR, which is where that's the format in best ball, you got to score. Can Drake London score? Absolutely. But guess who else he has on his team? His Kyle Pitts.
Yeah.
His Bijan Robinson, right? So I think yes, the upgrades need to count for something. They absolutely do. But it's not going to just immediately click right away. things are not just going to fall into place right away, where he starts, kind of delivering top 12 results right away. I really think Drake London is going to have kind of an up and down start to the season. I would love, I'm talking about this in May, so I might, this could maybe get clipped up and make me look like a fool. I think he's going to be an excellent buy low candidate. Now, the question is then, are people really going to be selling him that low? Probably not, but you never know. There may be an overachiever at the beginning of the year. You compare that up and go get him later. I just don't, I don't want, I will not push myself to go get Drake London. If he, reasonably priced and he falls to me in drafts, sure. I'm not going to go ahead and try to like get cute with it.
Yep.
Right. Exactly.
No, and that makes sense. And I think you bring up a good point because it's easy to look at, 69 receptions, 110 targets, 2 touchdowns. And you're like, wow, you bring in Kirk Cousins, there's a lot of room to grow. But we're thinking of the same thing about Kyle Pitts, right? I mean, so it's not like it's just a 1-for-1. You bring in Kirk, you bring in all these targets, you bring in these receptions, you bring in these touchdowns. It all goes Drake London. No, it's got to go to Pitts. Then obviously Bijan's going to get his too, right? I mean, you don't draft a guy with the 8th overall pick, even if it's a new regime there, and not use him, especially a guy of Bijan's talent. So I still think he's going to perform very well. I think he's going to be that borderline wide receiver 1 in this offense. Obviously, I think the touchdowns are going to come up. That's why I have him at the wide receiver 14. But I do agree. I struggle in best ball drafts right now. And if his redraft ADP is the same, I'm going to struggle to draft him there as the wide receiver 10 because it feels like you're really reaching at his ceiling. Maybe, he gets like a wide receiver 7 season. But, right, that's if everything goes right. I mean, it's just hard drafting something. It felt like Jaylen Waddle last year. It felt like we're taking this guy at his ceiling right now. It feels like a lot of these guys, and I know we're talking redraft and we keep bringing up best ball drafts, but that's just because what we're in right now. And best ball and redraft stay relatively similar, right? I mean, the ADPs aren't like multiple rounds off. We're usually within some. And when you come into that second round, it feels like there's a lot of wide receivers who you're taking at their ceiling. Right in the beginning of the second round, whereas when you get to the end, you're like, oh, hey, this guy could outperform where he's at. So that's definitely the way I feel with Drake London right now. All righty, let's move on before we take our quick break. It's Mr. DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. He was wide receiver 6 last season. He had 136 targets, 96 receptions, 1,364 yards, and 8 touchdowns. I think he is both of our wide receiver 16s.
Correct.
Which is a little surprising to me.
Wow,
I think it's more.
I think on something.
I think it's more surprising that I'm a little lower, but at the same time, I'm looking at the guys ahead. And I just don't know if I could have put him much higher on my list. Obviously, wide receiver 6 last year. Obviously, gets quarterback upgrade with Caleb Williams. No matter how much you love Justin Fields, you have to admit this is a quarterback upgrade for him. But he brings in Keenan Allen. He brings in Rome Odunze. So, Ty, how are you going about kind of weighing that? He's got the upgrade at quarterback, but they're also bringing in the other weapons.
Right where I have him ranked, honestly. Like this kind of middle of the road guy that can give you some top 10 weeks, right? Mm-hmm. Because he's got Caleb Williams as his quarterback.
Yep.
But it's going to, I think DJ Moore could have a pretty frustrating year just on a week-to-week basis because for all we know, it could be DJ Moore one week and then it could be Keenan Allen another week, right? So I think a lot of people, I think DJ Moore could be the wide receiver that gets drafted way more earlier than I would want to, because I think a lot of people still don't really think that Keenan Allen is like a legit threat in this wide receiver room. Like currently, I keep going back to best ball. Like you said, that's what we're doing right now. DJ Moore is like the wide receiver 18 going. I'm gonna find that, but DJ Moore is wide receiver 18. Keenan Allen is the wide receiver 30.
Yeah.
So there's already a too wide of a discrepancy for me. DJ Moore is going early third round. Keenan Allen is going pick 52, 53 would be late round 4. Mid
Beginning
round
around
4?
5. Beginning
Yeah,
around 5.
round 5.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think that's more Keenan Allen's going too late because let's be honest. I don't know if DJ Moore falls off enough where he, is outside of the top 25, 26 wide receivers as long as he's healthy. But at the same time, there is a non-zero chance that Keenan Allen is the wide receiver 1 in this offense, fantasy-wise.
True.
I think that's what scares me a little bit is just knowing how good Keenan Allen is. I know he's getting up there in age, but knowing the type of wide receiver he is too. He's the possession guy. He's the get open guy. He's the catch everything you throw at him guy, whereas DJ Moore is more of a downfield threat. I don't know. There is definitely a non-zero chance that Keenan Allen is the wide receiver 1 in this offense. And then obviously Rome Odunze could come out and just be special,
True.
right? And
Yeah.
that's kind of what we project him to be. So it'll be interesting. It could be very similar to what we got in Houston right now.
Yeah, I think there, like you said, there's a non-zero chance. Keenan Allen is going to be playing the slot more times than not.
Yeah.
He's going to be open the quickest.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's really that easy.
Yes. All righty. We will be right back after a word from our friends over at Underdog to talk about the rest of the top 15 wide receivers.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100.
Welcome back. I'm not even going to try to be like Lucas anymore. I've given up. We're just going with the welcome back. No and or anything. We're just going to keep on cruising because we got 14 more wide receivers to talk about. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit less about some of the top guys just because you know why Tyreek Hill is good. You know he's going to be good this season, right? So we don't need to spend as much time on him. But at 14, we are going to talk about Mr. Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. He is our wide receiver 14. He is both of our wide receiver 15, meaning we have a little bit of disagreement up ahead on our board. Last season, 156 targets, 109 receptions, 1,152 yards. And again, the disappointing thing for Michael Pittman, 4 touchdowns.
Yep.
Career high, 6 touchdowns. Now, the interesting thing for Pittman this season is we only saw a couple games with Anthony Richardson last year, right? We had a lot of Gardner Minshew, unfortunately, after Richardson's shoulder injury in the beginning of the season. So, Tyler, as you're kind of looking at this, do you think Anthony Richardson is better for Pittman than Gardner Minshew, or is he worse for Pittman than Gardner Minshew?
I think I don't want to say they're the same, but it's the fact that Michael Pittman is the one in this offense, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, they did go out and get A.D. Mitchell in the draft. He's going to take a while to adjust. You've got Josh Downs, who was in the slot and who had some pretty good weeks as well. Michael Pittman is by and far the number one in this offense. So I don't think it's a matter of necessarily like, what quarterback is going to like help him sustain his performances. The fact is that this guy could be averaging 9, 10, 11 targets a game because there is no one else in this offense, right? The question is just the touchdowns. And I think you and I would err on the side of like, we're probably going to see another like 4 or 5 touchdown season for Michael Pittman, which is not great. But that's why we got him here at 14 and we both have him ranked as our wide receiver 15. It's just because he's a volume play. If he was going to get more touchdowns, he'd crack our top 12 and probably our top 10 as well. But
yeah,
that it's just what you have with Anthony Richardson as your quarterback and Jonathan Taylor now, who will play a full season in the backfield.
Definitely. And that's like the touchdowns are going to get worse. At least, right? You're not like, oh, he just had a 13 last year. I wonder what it's going to, we're
Right.
not worried about it coming back to 6. Like 4 is about as bad as it's going to get. If he goes under 4 this season, right? I mean, you're going to be pretty shocked at that. There is always a chance to get an 8. I mean, or something, 7, 8 in that range. And if you get that, then you're pleasantly surprised. It's just with Pittman, like you said, it's a run first team, and it's going to be, and it has to be when you have Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor, right? I mean, that's just the way that offense has to run. AD Mitchell should be a good addition for Pittman, actually, because he's going to help stretch the field.
Yep.
Right. Alec Pierce, we've joked about it a couple times, right? That man was just out there running wind sprints all
Cardio
time.
king.
I mean, that's exactly what he was doing. And now you got AD Mitchell, who hopefully, can distract the defense a little bit, and they're not just watching him run up and down the field. But yeah, Michael Pittman, I think we said it last year. He's just a solid wide receiver too, right? We're not expecting top 5 upside, but you're going to expect some consistency from Michael Pittman. This next guy, Brandon Aiyuk, we might see a little more up and down. And a lot of that's got to do with the fact he had 105 targets, 75 receptions, 1,342 yards, and 17.9 yards per reception, 7 touchdowns. He was top 10 wide receiver last year, wide receiver 15 the season before, and yet, like Deebo, is yet to go over 115 targets. For me in Utah, I have him as the wide receiver, my wide receiver 12. You have him as wide receiver 13. And I don't know. I don't know how to feel about Brandon Aiyuk, because if you're talking where he's going ADP wise, I struggle a little bit, right? Because he's the wide receiver 12 right now in best ball. In the stay that high in redraft, I might struggle a little bit as well, because it does feel like, unless the volume comes out of nowhere, right? Like they move off of Deebo, it really feels like the vision to get him to a top 5 finish, I just don't know if I see it. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I'm currently doing some research on just wide receivers going into their 5th year in their career. That averaged 18 yards a catch, 18 yards per reception, right? How drastic of a drop off do they see in the following year? And I would err on the side of, I mean, if you see 3 less yards per catch, you're a guy like Brandon Aiyuk who's getting 70 receptions. It's roughly like 200 yards, right? So I didn't think I would be as like concerned or worried for Brandon Aiyuk as I am. That being said, like he's borderline wide receiver 1, and I would probably say, for how low I am on Drake London, I'm probably a little too high on Brandon Aiyuk.
Yeah, it's definitely tough, because you're just like, man, which way do we go with it with Aiyuk here? You look at Kittle last season, crazy high yards per reception as well. So obviously, if any offense is going to maintain this efficiency, it's San Francisco. But to bank on him staying at 18 and to bank on Kittle staying at 16, it just feels like a little bit more of a stretch than I'm comfortable with. And it does feel like, even looking at this ranking now, I'm like, I feel like I might still be too high on Brandon Aiyuk for this season, because something's gonna have to happen for him to finish as high or better than what he did last year.
Yeah, I'm just pulling this up now. So Brandon Aiyuk last year, he averaged, you got that stat right,
17.9 yards per reception.
So if we just look at wide receivers, by the way, real quick, I'm doing this research over on the RotoViz screener. Highly recommend. You can play with different stats in different metrics over the last 20 something years, and it'll pull all these wide receivers who match that data, and you can see fantasy points and how they turn out. The only, let's do like 18.3. The only notable wide receiver besides Brandon Aiyuk to have 17.8 as a minimum yards per reception and still have a relatively successful fantasy season afterwards was Tyler Lockett.
Yeah.
And that was back in 2018 and 2019. Otherwise, we're looking at wide receivers like Ashley Lilly, DeVar Darling, Sonoris Moss, Jason McAdley, Demetrius Williams, Marquise Wilson.
I know, because just thinking, I know Deebo was super high. He came back down to about 12. Chase was around 18, came back to about 12. Jaylen Waddle, we just talked about, was around 18, came back to 14, right? So to maintain that 2 years in a row just doesn't happen.
Yep.
It just doesn't. So you have to expect, unless somehow the volume comes from somewhere, the yardage is probably going to come down. And on a team like this, seeing 12, 13 touchdowns to kind of make up for that yardage feels very, very unlikely.
Yep. And again, Tyler Lockett, the only notable name in 2018, 17.8. In 2019, 13.
Yeah.
And the only reason why he maintained his relevance in fantasy, because he finished with like 207 fantasy points in 2018, 202 then in 2019, is because he got an uptick in volume. That's how you counteract it. I don't see Brandon Aiyuk getting an uptick in volume after adding Ricky Pearsall, still keeping Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, and Deebo Samuel are all still there as well.
Yeah, unless someone gets moved. Obviously, everything changes if one of him or Deebo gets moved.
True.
All right, let's move on to our next guy, Mr. Chris Olave. He's my wide receiver 13, your wide receiver 11, our consensus wide receiver 12. He's such a tough one. He really is a tough one for me. Finished the wide receiver 24 last year, 138 targets, 87 receptions, 1,123 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Still has Derek Carr as his quarterback. It's for Chris Olave, right? There's no one else there. But what is the upside for Chris Olave? Like, real quick, what do you see as like the highest Chris Olave could finish this season in his current situation?
Wide receiver 11.
Really?
And that's just with like insane volume. And there's a path, but I would say it's I think, gosh, I didn't think I would be as concerned or worried about Brandon Aiyuk, and I will throw Chris Olave into this as well. I'm making a best ball video tomorrow that will come out tomorrow about the worst values right now in Best Ball Mania. Chris Olave is one of them because he's going at this range in best ball drafts as early to mid second round pick. For a guy like that, you need to have some serious touchdown upside and have a path to seeing more targets. Yes, there is a very small path because it's no longer Sean Payton's sidekick as the offensive coordinator. It's Clint Kubiak. So does he, move some things around in the offense and that kind of opens up Chris Olave? Yeah, absolutely. We've seen it before. I just don't think the chances of that happening are that great. So I would already venture out to say, like, for my way too early rankings, probably a little too high on Chris Olave, Brandon Aiyuk. Probably need to be a little more in on Drake London.
That's the issue. That's the issue, right? Because all these guys feel like they're in the same tier. They really do. Yeah. And so you're just kind of fighting it. For me, I like Chris Olave more just because he is the wide receiver 1. He is the only guy in this offense. And we have seen Derek Carr just volume the crap out of a guy with Davante Adams. So that's the hope with Chris Olave, right? That the volume just continues to come, that he takes another step forward. It's just not going to be efficient. Touchdowns aren't going to be crazy high out there. So that's kind of where it is with Chris Olave. Doesn't feel like he necessarily is going to crack into that, top 7 wide receivers this season, but I believe that he's going to be a fringe top 10 wide receiver this year, partly because I do believe in his talent and partly because just his situation. All right, next we got, speaking of that guy, we got Davante Adams and Mike Evans, which I think it's fitting that we're talking about them together because they do feel very similar, don't they? We're talking about 2 guys who 3 of the last 4 years have had double-digit touchdowns, which is pretty wild. Davante Adams, 18, 11, 14, and then 8 last season. Mike Evans, 13, 14, 6, and 13 last year. Davante is my wide receiver 9, your wide receiver 12. Mike is my wide receiver 11, your wide receiver 10. Tyler, real quick, I'll just give you the stat line from last year on each of them. Davante, 175, 103, 1,144 yards and 8 touchdowns. Mike Evans, 79 receptions, 136 yards, 1,250 or 136 targets, 1,255 yards and 13 touchdowns. Ty, if you're staring these two down in a draft, who are you leaning here? Are you going Mike Evans or are you going Davante Adams? I know your rankings say Mike Evans, so I guess maybe why are you going Mike Evans over Davante Adams?
Part of it will be where Mike Evans will be going in drafts. But this also comes down to the fact that it's Baker Mayfield or Gardner Minshew. So like choosing the better of two pretty, I don't want to say mid, but two
as far as NFL quarterbacks go.
Right. And I guess the one saving grace for Mike Evans also is that his offensive coordinator is not a guy that decided to run the ball over 50% of the time, right? Luke Getsy in Vegas. Probably the most under-discussed part of this too, though, is that besides Mike Evans, it's the run game of Chris Godwin over in Tampa. And we saw Mike Evans thrive in that. So his situation has not really changed besides the offensive coordinator change. Davante Adams, team adds Brock Bowers. Yes, you lose Josh Jacobs, but they clearly trust Zamir White. Like that was evident towards the end of last year. So between Davante, Jacoby Myers, and Brock Bowers, I know you've been using some like running back references to describe these wide receivers.
Yeah.
Davante Adams feels like Dameon Pierce in the way that like people are not going to give enough credit to Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers for being legit pieces in the Vegas offense, right? That's how people were like, this is Dameon Pierce's backfield. Like Devin Singletary won't have that much of a role in the offense. And it's like, no, he will. And that's exactly how it'll work with Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers in this Vegas offense. So for, again, ADP reasons, quarterback play, and also just competition, then I think that would be why I'm much more okay with Mike Evans and Davante Adams.
No, that makes sense. I think I just lean Davante just because when I think of it, I think he can still see 175 targets, whereas I think Mike Evans can be around that 140 target mark. It'll be how often can he find the end zone. But I will say, I remember last year being frustrated as the Davante manager when Jacoby was healthy, because Jacoby was seeing 9-10 targets. And you're just like, what the heck? Why are we not throwing to Davante Adams right now? So that definitely is a slight concern for Davante Adams. Alrighty, we're going to move on from some veterans and talk about the rookie. The only rookie on this list. I know Neighbors was just off for both of us. But Marvin Harrison finds himself all the way at 9. And I know there's a lot of people who are going to be like, really? You want Marvin Harrison here? Like we're talking about? He is the wide receiver 1 in this offense. Kyler Murray's back healthy. And if you watch him last season and the season before, you know how good Marvin Harrison Jr. is, right? I mean, I still think my favorite comp was, I don't remember who it was. It's like if Marvin Harrison had a 6'4" son. It's like he plays the same way as his dad, except he's 6'4". And that's why we talked about him like AJ Green. Right. He's a dominant wide receiver when he's out there, and he falls into the lap of Kyler Murray, who has to be excited.
You know who made the comp?
I
was trying to remember who it was. It's Danny Kelly from The Ring.
Oh, that's exactly. Yep, there it is. And so, Tyler, are you worried about having Marvin Harrison here, or are you pretty confident that this guy from the get-go is at worst a top 15 wide receiver?
I'm kind of torn on it because I do think we are drafting him at his ceiling a little bit. But that being said, I don't think Marvin Harrison Jr. is one of these guys that is, we're drafting him at his ceiling, but I don't think he's like going to lose you anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus a Brandon Aiyuk or Chris Olave, guys that have very favorable roles, but guys that I maybe we even throw Michael Pittman into it too, right? Like guys that you will forever and always hear us say, and a lot of other fantasy people say, volume is king, right? That's typically used for running backs. Kind of makes sense for wide receivers in some ways too. So when you hear that, you're going to hear Chris Olave, you're going to hear Michael Pittman because they get just hyper targeted. But I don't think with where Marvin Harrison Jr. will go in drafts, you will lose because of him. He is still going to be a very good option. Is he got the, going as a wide receiver, as our wide receiver 9, can he crack this like top 8 list? There is a way, but I would say it's very tough because these top 8 guys that we have are very set. So
yeah,
Marvin Harrison is an interesting one because again, like he's a rookie. He has not played a single snap of NFL football. And we have him as a top 10 guy in our early rankings.
Yeah.
But again, you're not going to lose because of Marvin Harrison Jr.
No, and he has the Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Puka Nacua rookie upside.
Yes,
he does. I mean, that's why he's that high. He could easily find his way in the top 5 just based how good he is. Are we projecting that? No, but having a quarterback like Kyler Murray in a system where this offense projects to be a lot better, he could definitely find his way there. Alrighty, next we got Mr. Garrett Wilson. We talking about Chris Olave's QB struggles. Garrett Wilson's probably has taken the cake on that through his first 2 years of Zach Wilson, Mike White, Joe Flacco. Who am I missing? Who else was there?
Why am I blanking on this?
Was it Trevor Siemian? Is that who else was throwing passes? Or
I'm gonna look this up because
it's so bad we can't even remember who's throwing this guy passes. He still sees 168 targets last year, 95 receptions, 1,042 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And if we're being honest, I think 168 targets is well within the range of outcomes for him again this season. Except 168 targets from Aaron Rodgers is very different than 168 targets from, any old Joe Schmo. Just ask Davante Adams, right? So the quarterback upgrade just cannot be understated for Garrett Wilson this year. And that's why we have him up at wide receiver 8, despite him finishing outside the top 20 wide receivers again last season. Is he a guy that you think, Ty, has that top 5 upside with Aaron Rodgers now? Do we think he can make that run to kind of be in that mix of the Justin Jeffersons, Amon Ra's, Jamar Chases?
Yeah, I do. And I think it just comes down to the fact that Garrett Wilson is the guy that Rodgers will be targeting. Yes, you've got Breece Hall. Sorry, there is no one else that should be getting 80, 90 targets in this offense. You can have a litany of other guys. Sure, you can have Allen Robinson. You can have Tyler Conklin. You can have Malachi Corley, each getting like 40, 50, 60 targets. Garrett Wilson should be locked in for like 150 targets. Because again, there is no one else in this offense outside of Breece Hall to move the ball downfield.
And we've seen the flashes from Garrett Wilson so far in the NFL, right? Like he looks good with really, really bad quarterback play. So it is kind of exciting to see, just to think what could be with Garrett Wilson. He kind of feels like that guy right now in the NFL. We're just like, what could be if he gets the quarterback? And barring another, crazy setback from Rodgers, I think we're finally going to get to see it. Alrighty, I think we have a tie coming up next. Yes, we do. Puka Nacua and AJ Brown. It's kind of funny that they're a tie. If you would have said this last year that we had these guys tied on our way too wide receiver rankings before the season started, people would have been like, "What are you talking about?" But AJ Brown this last season, 158 targets, 106 receptions, 1,456 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Puka Nacua had 160 targets, which I think is a rookie record, 105 receptions, rookie record, 1,486 yards, rookie record, but only 6 touchdowns, surprisingly. I currently have AJ Brown at 6, and you have him at 7. And then I have Puka at 7. You have him at 6. So I will talk AJ Brown, and you get to talk Puka Nacua. But I'll start because I'm more important. AJ Brown last season had a very different year than he did his first year with Jalen Hurts. Right, his first year was Jalen Hurts, 88 receptions, but he had 17 yards per reception. This last 88 receptions, but then 17 yards per reception. Excuse me. This last season, 106 receptions, but only 13.7. Right, so he evened out. He did kind of what we were talking about with Brandon Aiyuk. The volume came up, right? So the yards were similar, right? 1,456 yards, 1,496 yards. The only big difference this last year was he had 7 touchdowns instead of 11 the year before. The reason AJ Brown's going to stay this high is because he's 150 targets. He's going to be flirting with 100 yards. He's going to be 100 receptions. He's going to be flirting with 1,500 yards because he's going to always be flirting with double-digit touchdowns. He is a fantastic wide receiver, right? I mean, he is a bully when he is out there, but he's also faster than almost everybody else. He can jump higher than everybody else, and he's dangerous from the ball in his hands, right? There really isn't much he can't do. And he's on an offense that played not great last season and still put up 1,500 yards. So there is a lot to be excited about with AJ Brown, but I do think that ADP wise, it's okay if him and this guy Puka that you're going to talk about are flip flopped.
Yeah. So Puka, by all means, needs to be locked into the top 7. Needs to. With his rookie year, with how this Rams offense is now kind of set up to play, the guy is the target getter. Cooper Kupp's presence will not affect him. We saw that last year, even when they played. Are we going to see some regression? That's the question that we got to ask. Certainly possible. Certainly possible. But we are talking about a guy going to year 2 in this Sean McVay offense with a very good quarterback that can distribute and facilitate. I don't see any reason why. I mean, these guys just miss out on the top 5 just because there's just other wide receivers in their room. And that's really about it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if they were by themselves, they'd be top 5. They would be top 5 guys. It's just a matter of there's only one ball in their offense. I mean, for AJ Brown, Davante Smith, Saquon Barkley, Dallas Goedert, Jalen Hurts, Puka, Cooper Kupp, Kyron Williams, Blake Corum, if he's going to get involved at all. Like, these guys have top 5 upside, can give you weekly top 5 finishes. But I think their floor is just going to be a little bit lower than some of these guys that we're going to talk about coming up just because of their situations.
Most definitely. Alrighty, Amon Ra St Brown. We do not need to spend much time on this guy.
He's good at the football. Move on.
He is so ridiculously good. 164 targets, 119 receptions, 1,500 yards, and 10 touchdowns. Everybody knows the ball's going to him 12 times a game, and nobody can stop him. He is always open, and this Detroit team moves the ball so exceptionally well, and he has just gotten better since his rookie season, right? I mean, he finished wide receiver 9 in 2022, and so you're like, oh, what kind of jump can he take? I was a little skeptical if he could find the end zone enough to get up to the top 5, and then he's a wide receiver 3. I mean, is there anything you want to add about it, or we're just he's top 5, and if you have him top 2, I really can't blame you at this point.
No, he's one of my favorite best ball picks in the first round if I'm in the middle of the first round.
Oh, 100%. Because people have moved him out of that top 4 tier when he most definitely belongs in it. The StreamYard is picking up my thumbs up when I'm fixing my AirPod and thinks I'm thumbs up on. Alrighty, we'll move on to our wide receiver 4, Justin Jefferson, or our 3B, I guess. And this really comes down to the fact that I have him as my wide receiver 2, and Tyler, you got him as your wide receiver 5. I'm going to real quick paint my pro argument for him.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of say why he's 5. I mean, the negative argument is, he's a wide receiver 5, right? So it's not like negative, but we got to nitpick this high up in the rankings. For me, 1,000 yards last season in 10 games. Half of those games with a backup quarterback. And the dude averaged over 100 yards per game. But And I still had 5 touchdowns, 15.8 yards per reception. He averaged 21 points per game those last 4 games last year with Nick Mullins, Jaron Hall, and whoever else was throwing the ball. And I understand he's got Sam Darnold, JD McCarthy, but with Kevin O'Connell calling the plays, he's going to be open. And it doesn't matter who's throwing the ball. He's good enough that they're going to throw the ball to him. So for me, that's why I have him at 2 still. I still think he is the best wide receiver in the NFL. That is why I have him at 2, and that's why I can't put him lower.
It makes sense. But you're just wrong. I'm kidding. I tweeted out a couple days ago, maybe it was last week already. If getting Kirk Cousins is a huge get for the Atlanta Falcons, then it's a huge loss for the Vikings. Is 5 too low? No, it's a top 5. These top 5 guys are in a tier. And if you want to, you can probably put Tyreek and Ceedee in a tier above these 3 guys that we're talking about right now. But again, the loss of Kirk has to mean something. Yes, he just did it with Nick Mullins and Jaron Hall and all of them. But at least like Nick Mullins was in the quarterback room for a year and a half. So he was familiar with O'Connell's scheme and stuff. We're talking about Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy, who are learning this summer. So look, we're nitpicking. Justin Jefferson's a top 5 pick. Don't get cute with it. Don't get scared off by the quarterbacks. He's still a top 5 wide receiver. I can't. I see less. I think it's less likely that he's a top 3 guy this year than he has been in the past. But when I say less likely, we're talking like 30% chance versus like 15% as it was last year. So draft good football players. And that's what Justin Jefferson is.
Yep. Alrighty. The other guy at 3 we have is Jamar Chase. I have him as my wide receiver 4. Ty, you got him as wide receiver 3. Obviously, 2 straight finishes outside the top 10, but I feel like those are pretty easily explained. 2 years ago, we only played 12 games, and he was still the wide receiver 12. So pretty impressive there. Last year, his starting quarterback tore something in his thumb and missed half the season. So he still put up 100 receptions, still put up 1,216 yards, and still put up 7 touchdowns last year. If Joe Burrow's healthy, it doesn't matter who else is on this team because him and Jamar Chase have got unreal chemistry when they're out there together, and they're just going to make it happen. So I really can't justify putting him any lower than 4 for me. Maybe you can argue Amon Ra, but I can't. And then he's still got wide receiver 1 upside. Anything you want to add on Jamar Chase?
He is probably the riskiest of the top 5 guys, and the
riskiness
is not even that much.
Yep. No, I'll definitely give you that one. At 2, we have CeeDee Lamb. He's my wide receiver 3. Ty's wide receiver 2. 181 targets, 135 receptions, 1,749 yards, 12 touchdowns. Ty, why should people buy in on CeeDee Lamb right now?
Give me a second while I pull up some stats. There we go. Even if he averaged 23.7 fantasy points per game last year. If he regresses at all, it's like 21 fantasy points per game, because that's just how important he is to that offense. I will repeat again. Last year, bit of an anomaly, bit of an outlier season, just because they went to him so often and so consistently. They will continue to do that. It just won't be at the same rate as it was last year. But even so, he's a top 3 guy. I mean, the wide receiver 3 last year in points per game, 21.5 from Keenan Allen. That is CeeDee Lamb if we see any regression. If it gets worse than that, 20.7 was the wide receiver 4 in fantasy points per game. Yeah, we don't need to overcomplicate it at all. Like, CeeDee Lamb is very good at the football.
Yep. Took a major step forward, and he's got the same quarterback next year. Same offensive scheme.
Same situation too. And actually even with no run game at this point.
Yeah, they're going to be throwing that ball a lot, and he's going to see a lot of targets. And then we have our last guy, Tyreek Hill. You can't argue with it at this point.
Nope.
Two
And if you
straight seasons
do,
without,
I really want to hear your argument.
yeah, 2 straight seasons without Mahomes, 170 targets in each, 119 targets in each, 1,799 yards this last year, 1,700 yards the year before. He had 13 touchdowns last season. Okay, maybe he scores 10. Maybe he has 1,500 yards. Maybe he has 115 targets. He's still better than what AJ Brown was this year. Like, right, that's what we're talking about with CeeDee Lamb is we see the regression, and okay, he's a wide receiver 5. It's just crazy the numbers that these two put up last season, and especially for Tyreek Hill has been so consistent doing it for so long. Yeah, it's not going anywhere. It's not. Alrighty. Well, that wraps up. Yeah.
Guys, if you really want to nitpick at any of these top 5 guys, be our guest.
Yeah, but just don't do it with Tyreek.
Seriously, like you will make yourself look a fool.
Yes,
for disagreeing with Tyreek Hill being number 1, number 2, or number 3.
Yeah, for sure. Alrighty, well, that wraps up our top 20 wide receivers. Because of my move, because the things got a little crazy, we are not going to do the top 12 tight ends, but our top 12 tight ends will be in our draft consensus guide, or our draft guide. So you'll get to see them in there. Make sure you purchase that, and we'll touch on them multiple. I think we're doing rankings, I think, again in another like week and a half or month and a half, 2 months. So you'll get to see it then. And who really cares about tight ends? That's all I got to say. But
hey, Taylor
actually, I will
have something to say about that.
I will say this year it is more interesting than it has been in the years past, just because we got some young bloods up in there. But
True.
Tyler, bringing you the best, right?
Worst.
Or no, worst.
Lucas did the best. I'm doing the worst.
Tyler's going to be doomsday, bringing you the worst values in best ball coming up. If you're not doing best ball drafts, you need to. That is like our life right now with best ball drafts. I go to work at 6:30, and then I work till 3:30, and then I do a best ball draft, and then I go work on this new house that we bought that we've ripped down to the studs, and work on fixing that up till 10, and then I do another best ball draft. And that's my entire day for the last week, and it will be for the next 2 weeks. But I get my 2 best ball drafts in there because I know what I'm doing. Ty, anything you want to add for the people before we sign off?
Stay tuned. Fellas? Stay tuned. Our draft guide, we're shooting for June 1st. That's when it will be released. We will let you all know how you can find that and purchase that. But follow us on all socials because we are getting closer and closer to football season as the days go on. And we are 105 days, 106 days from the start of the regular season. So, hey, again, if you are in best ball drafts, getting ready for your dynasty drafts, your dynasty startups, or just redraft drafts, give us a follow on our personals. I'm Tyler_Plath. Cameron is Cam Law FFF. Lucas is Lucas Wenzel.
Yep. He's
How
the opposite
boring
of you.
Is that? Like, at least they're all
go
like
last first, and he goes first last.
No, but seriously, give us a follow on the socials. Like, we talk fantasy football, we talk football every day. So follow us over there. And yeah, stay tuned to our worst best ball values coming out tomorrow.
Yeah. And most importantly of all, go Wolves.
Go Wolves.
Yes, sir. All righty. Ty will see you tomorrow. I will see you next week. Deuces.